Good evening. Welcome to Horizon Mennonite Church. Let's begin with number 89 in the Zion's Praises. Number 89. Number 440. For me to live is Christ, to die is endless gain. For Him I gladly bear the cross and welcome grief. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441. 441.
Good evening. We welcome you to our service here this evening. Hope you had a restful Mother's Day. I know for some mothers it's not very restful Sundays normally, so there's that. So tonight is our second and final installment of Anabaptist history, and I know Linford here has 100 years to cover, so I'm not going to take much of his time. I'm going to let him get straight to it, and we can be going with that. Linford's going to have his part, and then after that we ask for one more song, and then Brother Randy, would you close with a final benediction? Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear God, we just thank you for bringing us all together here this evening. Lord, we ask you to bless Linford and to give him clarity of thought. Lord, help us to learn what you would have us to learn this evening. Lord, go with us throughout this coming week. Bless and guide everyone in this building. We ask this all in your name. Amen.
Good evening, and I greet you in our Lord's name. Thank you again for showing some interest in this, even though I'm sure you could have benefited from spending time with your mother. So I've already had a few questions and comments about this span of 1880 to 1980. Why 1880? And that is interesting. In part one, the last time, we took it pretty much up to 1880. But the truth is that the Mennonites did change much from 1880 to about 1930. In fact, there's a whole book written about the Mennonites and the changes they made in that 50-year span. Culture does not decide to suddenly pick up the pace at the very turn of the century. You know, that's unpredictable. So for the Mennonites, 1880, around that time, they started making significant changes, and we hope to be able to notice some of that here this evening. And then, of course, why end at 1980? Well, frankly, we were not even going to be able to cover this 100-year span very well. And for safety's sake, when we get up into the divisions of the 60s that some of you all actually lived through and have connections very closely to people who lived through it, I would be wise not to say much. So we'll see what if we can do at least halfway justice to this span of time. I am a little more nervous about this, the events through the 20th century. It's a complicated time. Lots of heavy concepts, lots of big words that historians use to describe things that were happening. And I see all these students sitting here, and well, I'll try to define these big words as we go here, and hopefully it makes sense. So you can pray to that end. The 20th century is a complex time in the world and for the Mennonites as well, and obviously we just know more about this time. More has been written. It's closer to us, and it affects us. And a history teacher, teaching the 20th century is fun and fascinating, and students enjoy it, but one of the challenges is when you teach it, you realize that you can spin it just about any way you want. And that's about half dangerous. And I know that I carry a bias. If I were to tell you what it is, I would tell you that I think that I am somewhat cynical. And you'll have to forgive that, I guess. Maybe it comes with being 50. I don't know. But I will try to be, I hope to be fair. I'm praying that I can be fair and not take this or interpret it in a wrong way. Those of you that know these things better than me, I humbly stand corrected if I get something wrong. All right, so toward the end of the last session, we looked at the far-reaching influence of John F. Funk in his publication, his periodical called the Herald of Truth, and Mennonites all over the world, all over the United States and Canada, read this publication, were influenced by it, began to pick up on the progressive ideas. There's another part to this story that's important that we did not talk about the last time, but tonight we're going to start with that, and that is that in 1879, about the year that we want to start here tonight, John F. Funk invited a promising young minister from Virginia to come work with him in this publishing house in Elkhart, Indiana. His name was John S. Kaufman, and yes, that is the correct spelling of his name. He was ordained a minister at Bank Mennonite Church in 1875, and he was a talented teacher and a music teacher. He loved to sing and lead singing schools, and he was a gifted leader and a gifted speaker. And John F. Funk had his eye on him and began to work to steal him out of Virginia. And he managed to do that. John S. Kaufman only served in Virginia 4 years, and he moved out to Elkhart, where he became the assistant editor of Herald of Truth and began writing Sunday school material. But John S. Kaufman, his influence actually really came in the area of evangelism. And Kaufman held his first revivals in Michigan in 1881, and he would go on to hold revivals in just about every area of the Mennonite world by the time he died. Kaufman died young, in his 50s, from stomach cancer. He died right before the turn of the century in 1899. He was a forceful and confident speaker, and he won the respect of a lot of young people, which was actually the burden that he carried. He was desperate that so many of the young people were leaving the church, and he wanted to see that changed. Kaufman was a very sincere, impassioned evangelist, but he was not a show-off like the Protestant evangelists tended to be. But neither did he use the sing-songy approach that the Mennonite preachers used to be good at. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that. You young people, you don't remember that. The Mennonite preaching has changed, and maybe John S. Kaufman had some influence into that. John S. Kaufman was a progressive. He promoted Sunday schools and English preaching and higher education. But, like Funk, he was cautious and respectful of traditional Mennonites and Amish. And when he came for meetings, if the community was unsure how long they wanted to go, he would say, "That's fine, I'm here, use me however you want." If they wanted him for 3 weeks, he would do it. If they only wanted him for 2 nights, that was fine too. But Kaufman was a progressive, and he could be snarky. In a letter to a young man, he talked about the Eastern bishops as the Lancaster Sanhedrin. That's what he called them. But he said we need them. We need the Lancaster Sanhedrin. They help balance us out. So with Funk's publishing and Kaufman's revivals, the last quarter of the 19th century became known as the Quickening. Among the Mennonites, sometimes it's also called the Mennonite Great Awakening. These men and others promoted significant change with their influence. Kaufman died in 1899, but his influence would continue. Now, as we looked at last time, this quickening and all of its progressive ideas was controversial. This is the slide that we ended up with the last time. This is a conflict between the progressives and the traditionals, And it formed an old order denomination in just about every major Mennonite community except this one. And we want to look tonight at why this community escaped an old order division. For illustration's sake, I gave these two characters up here names. Jerry is our traditional and Ben is our progressive. And these were the issues, at least some of them, that they divided over. And the rope split in these years during the quickening. And the divisions began to happen to form the old order groups. Now, if you remember, we closed with some observations. We observed that it looks for all the world like Ben pretty much nailed it. Ben is right. Ben won the day. Today, the churches in this area, all the conservative churches, support just about every one of Ben's proposed changes. And Jerry looks like an old-fashioned, short-sighted person who couldn't foresee how the church would benefit from these changes Ben proposed. But don't be too quick to judge Jerry. We didn't live then. We obviously have hindsight on our side. You see, both Ben and Jerry were making predictions about an unknown future. They could not know just how it would go. So actually, this division happened far enough into the past that we really should stop here for a little bit and think about divisions. How do you evaluate the divisions? Divisions are a part of our history, and this is one of them. When you evaluate a church division, you'll find that there are actually a lot of similarities in the divisions. Underneath, a lot of the root things are kind of the same. There's different outworkings at the top, but underneath, down deep, there's a lot of underlying principles that kind of drive the division. The tightening of the rope where it gets tighter and tighter and finally splits. When you evaluate a church division, keep this little graph in mind. This little graph shows a little inverse relationship between the distance from the event and the justification of the event. So in other words, the further you are removed from the division, the more accurately you can gauge the stupidity of it. And you've probably done that. And you probably also have noticed that people who are directly involved in a division, like Ben and Jerry, they don't feel at all like this is just a silly personality clash. To them, there are deeply justifiable reasons for what is going on. You can almost always see that. But the further you get away, any third party, and maybe the division is really intense, and so they invite in a third party to kind of help mediate things, and the third party says, well, you guys just can't get along. You're, knuckleheaded. And you know what? More often than not, the third party person gets dismissed because do you think that Ben and Jerry are going to stand up in a meeting and say, hey, the reason we're doing this is because we're just, we got bad personalities? No. No. To them, they are deeply discerning men. I don't know if you know this, but the Martyr's Mirror has a lot of stories about Dutch martyrs. And the Dutch have an interesting time in their history where they are splitting their churches at the same time they are burning at the stake. They split the church on Wednesday, and burn at the stake on Saturday. They cared passionately. Their convictions ran deep. You know what else is true about the Dutch Mennonites? As the years went by and they became wealthy and lethargic and apathetic and cold and worldly, they looked at each other and said, that was kind of silly. Let's have a merger. And so they'd merge and get back together again. And that also is very interesting. So you could say that standing at the front of the 20th century, the old order traditionalist made his predictions about the future and made a decision. Ben, the progressive, he stood at the beginning of the 20th century and he also made some predictions. If we could fix some of these broken things, we would revitalize the church. Jerry predicted if we fixed all the things Ben imagined we should fix, then we would become worldly and lose our way. Anyway, we can't really judge in a division the level of carnality or the level of personality. If you're a third party, that's kind of unknown to you. And even if you are directly involved, it gets really difficult to tell sometimes. At any rate, the rope tore and Ben and Jerry were flung into their respective ditches. And the old order would develop a culture separate from the progressives, from the Mennonite churches that that our history is connected to. As the 20th century passed on, both Ben and Jerry would need help to get out of their ditches that they flung themselves into. They kind of went to the extremes. Yeah, it's true. Ben appears to have come out right there on all the issues. We have Sunday school today. But you know what? Ben had to learn some really tough lessons about how to handle that wild animal called education. And yes, it's true, we have revivals today. But Ben had to learn some important lessons there too. And as we will see here in a minute, Ben had some lessons to learn when it came to changing from German preaching to English preaching. So these men struggled to predict the future. One thing they were very accurate at predicting, though, or at seeing, was the faults in the other. And this is maybe as good a summary as you can get for the issues of the 20th century. Ben looked at Jerry and saw materialism. He accused Jerry of being materialistic. And you know what? Ben was right. Jerry has a problem with materialism. There are some interesting observations about the old order divisions that are not immediately apparent. In fact, they baffle historians. Maybe you can think about why this would be, but one of the interesting things about the old order is when they divided, especially the one in Lancaster, is that maybe you would assume it was the old guys that were the traditionals. It wasn't. The average age of the traditionalist ministry was in the mid-40s. The average age of the progressives was the mid-60s. And when the old orders had their car buggy division later, the wealthy were the horse and buggy, and the less wealthy were the wanted to get cars. And historians kind of shake their heads at that a little, but that's the reality. Jerry is just fine with wealth and materialism. He doesn't really fear that. He's learned to handle that. What he's afraid of is Ben's professionalism. Now that he has an issue with. Jerry is afraid of Ben's professionalism. That's an issue. That's something to be concerned about. Ben's not really concerned about professionalism. That doesn't bother him. He's fine with that. What he's critical of is Jerry's uniformity. He thinks Jerry's kind of takes this, regulations and all this kind of to the extreme. Jerry, he likes his uniformity. That's good. That helps keep him safe. What he doesn't like is Ben's ecumenism. I guess that's a big word. What that means is you do as you do, I'll do as I do, and we'll all just kind of like each other. That's ecumenism or ecumenism. And that scared Jerry for sure. Ben, he kind of liked his ecumenism. He thought that was a good idea. What he didn't like is Jerry's isolationism, his withdrawal, his little withdrawn culture where he never gets out and doesn't want to do missions or do any outreach. And Jerry says, I'm being a witness. I have this beautiful little culture that everyone likes to come and see and take pictures of. That's a witness. What Jerry doesn't like is Ben's acculturation, where Ben says, I'm going to go reach the world. The way I'm going to reach the world is I'm going to be like the world. I'm going to be like the world to reach the world. Those little packages right there, those are the ideas on which you can hang just about every issue in the 20th century. And it's kind of fascinating how it always goes together. It's one package, the other package. And here again, as you think about that, you probably kind of know, where you are. Ben looks at Jerry and calls him spiritually dead. Jerry looks at Ben and says he's spiritually deceived. All right, well, that's enough for that. But you think about how many times these words will reoccur as we go through this 20th century issues. Now, let's jump back here and think a little bit how it is that our community escaped the old order divisions. And I think there's some important things to learn here. Here's a picture of Rife's Mennonite Church, which was built in 1891. This is not the building that's there today. When it was built in 1891, they put a raised platform in. And that did not make the conservative Ebes and Hursts and Martins very happy. But that happened. Now, Washington County is a little bit different than Lancaster County. In Lancaster County, they had a broad German culture. The Mennonites' German neighbors spoke German, and so there was German all over. In this county, the neighbors spoke English. The children went to English schools. The children kind of put off joining the church because they didn't like the German. They wanted the English. They liked the English. And so it was just more of a practical thing in this county to get into the English. Maybe that's one thing that helped us. But in spite of that, we still had very conservative people. It's not that we were all progressives for sure. No, indeed. That's not the case. Another reason why we were able to escape an old order division is because there were important progressive ministry in this community, in our churches here. They were progressive and they were influential, but they were very cautious and very respectful of traditional Mennonites. Now, Clear Spring was the first to get a raised platform in their church. And Daniel Roth was a minister there. And soon after that raised platform went in at Clear Spring, Daniel Roth came down here to Rife's to have a message, and he decided to preach on the sin of pride, which was maybe a bad selection for that Sunday, but he did. And afterwards, a brother came up to him. I don't know if it was a Hurst or an Eby or a Martin, but some brother came up to him and said, I don't greet a brother that preaches against pride but has a pulpit in his church. Well, that doesn't sound like very nice tact, but Daniel Roth showed and demonstrated his humility, and he said, I tell you what, I'm coming to your place for dinner today. And we're going to discuss this. Now back in that day, it was an honor for someone to come and say, I'm coming to your house for dinner. Today, that would be bad manners, but back then, that was kind of an honor. And so they did. They talked it out. I have no idea how Daniel Roth defended a raised platform. Maybe he used those verses in Ezra that the children had in their Sunday school lesson this morning. Ezra stood on a raised platform. I don't know. But somehow, according to the history, they worked it out and left as friends. That's commendable. This is a picture of a man who surely does not look like a progressive, but he was. His name is Adam Bear, and some of us are related to him. He's buried. Him and his wife are buried at Paradise, down the road from me. He was a preacher at Miller's and later at Paradise. And he favored progressive ideas like English preaching and Sunday schools, but he was very respectful of the Mennonite church, and this man did something that I find very commendable. The old traditional, actually he wasn't that old, he was middle-aged, but the traditional bishop was Michael Horst, and he was traditionally minded. But Michael Horst ran into financial distress pretty seriously, actually, and could not pay off his debts. And it got to the place where they actually, some ministry got together and tried to decide if maybe he shouldn't be relieved of his bishop duties. Now, you think about that a progressive minister like Adam Bear could have looked at that and said, one little bump, and we've got the traditionalists out of the way. And we can put in a progressive. One little bump. We almost got him there. In fact, we can make this look good. He's got financial problems. But Adam Bear and some others went together and gave of their own money to keep this traditionalist in place. A progressive spent his own money to keep a traditionalist in his role as bishop. Now, I don't know what you think of that, but you think about how when the rope begins to get pulled tight, we go to the extremes and we hate each other all the more. But when you pull together and you honor and respect each other, it leads to the kind of change you actually want. You know what Adam Bear reaped for that? Michael Horst, the traditionalist, got to the place in his older years where he actually approved of a Protestant English hymnal in Rife's Mennonite Church, and he also started preaching in English. And I find that very commendable. There's a third reason why we escaped an old order division, and that is because of the deep respect that the Mennonites had for God's calling in ordination. They considered that a very serious matter. And in 1892, Rife's was having an ordination, and I am sure that the Martin family was hoping very much that it would be a traditionalist. The Martin family was not called to church leadership. That's kind of interesting. And here they're having this ordination, and don't you know, George Keener was chosen. And he was an English speaking preacher, and he promoted Sunday schools. He was a progressive. And to the traditionalists' credit, they accepted that. It takes courage to stand up and lead. It takes courage to sit down and follow. And they sat down and they followed. And Rife's Mennonite Church got an English preacher. And eventually, George Keener would be their bishop. And I'm sure that they had to work through that. And they did. And so he escaped an old order division. We would not get through the 20th century without some, for sure. But we managed that one. All right, let's look at a timeline of some of the things we want to look at tonight. We already mentioned Kaufman's revivals, Old Order divisions. This next little span of events has to do with the development of the Mennonites as a denomination. That's getting into some more big words, but I am sure that you are aware, or at least feel, the influence of that big organizational denomination, committee, boards thing that the Mennonite church became in these years. So General Conference was organized 1898, Goshen College founded 1903, Eastern Mennonite College 1917, Garden City, adoption of new articles 1921, Doctrines of the Bible updated 1928. Those events helped to establish what we would call a Mennonite denominational identity, and very influential. It has an effect to the present day. And then a few more events that maybe have more to do with an Anabaptist identity. Harold S. Bender writes his Anabaptist vision. In the 50s, we have the Brunk revivals, which happens at a time when there is a great falling away, or an apostating, or a slipping into the world, or an acculturation, or revitalizing. It all depends on where you find yourself, what word you use to describe it. But this would be quite the tumultuous time. And so the 60s would begin the divisions and the forming of a conservative identity. And I don't have room on my slide up here for all the little conservative conferences that started, but that's us and a few of the people we associate with, scattered around the East Coast and the Mennonite world. So, 3 different identities that influence the Mennonites through the 20th century. A denominational identity, a historical identity, and a conservative identity. All of them, whether you realize it or not, affect you and how you function in your culture. Let's go back for a little bit to the Quickening and John S. Kaufman, and let's think about three initial 20th century changes that came to the Mennonites as they moved into the 20th century. The first change, of course, is that Kaufman and other evangelists, like A.D. Wenger and people like that, would be successful at convincing young people to stay in the church and also to become Christians at a younger age. Instead of waiting into their 20s and maybe even 30s in some cases, they began to get serious at a younger age, moved many times in these revival meetings. The second change is a little more serious, and I have tried hard to wrap my head around this. I don't profess to understand it all entirely. I think that Brother Dwayne understands this better. If I don't get this said right, I think Brother Dwayne can explain this. But in this time, and as they switched from German into English, people like John S. Kaufman and others, they attended Protestant Bible conferences, some places even Moody Bible Institute, and they were exposed to English preaching and English phrases to describe doctrinal concepts. And so for the Mennonites, changing from German to English and learning the new English doctrinal language, they unwittingly bought into some things. How unwittingly it is, I'm not sure that I understand. But you remember the last time how we said that Christian Burkholder, he talked about salvation as being this interesting combination of faith and obedience and lordship. And all those things are one, discipleship. That's all together. That was the way the Anabaptists looked at it. But John S. Kaufman will preach a separation. He will use words like the plan of salvation. He will use phrases like, are you saved? Past tense. And it began a subtle separation in the minds of Mennonites of this salvation over here, and then there's discipleship. In fact, they didn't talk so much about discipleship. They had this interesting word. They used the word restrictions. Boy, now that's negative. But it's the word they used. So they had the plan of salvation, the plan of salvation. And then there's some restrictions here that'll help you so that you can escape temptation. And so you have that classic thing of, the man in his canoe with the two oars, and you got the faith on the one side, the salvation, and then you got to have some works. And some people didn't get around to the works because the plan of salvation was enough. That sounded all great and good. But then others, oh boy, they got into the works, and they did the works like everything. Works, and more works. So this is an interesting change. When they talked about non-resistance and non-conformity and all those things, they used the word restrictions. But what they really liked to talk about was being saved. Past tense. And so that's an interesting thing. And that will not come back together for a number of decades. And this is why when I was young, Don Stelfox would come around and he would preach about this, and I didn't quite get it back then, but he would preach about, this is why I preach faith that works. And Dwayne has preached the same kind of sermons. We got to put this thing back together, right? But there was a time when the Mennonites kind of separated that, and they talked a lot about the plan of salvation. It was very much a way that the Protestants looked at it, a separation of grace and works. Well, the third change is that the Mennonites will develop a new essential Mennonite virtue. In the 19th century, that was humility, right? In the 20th century, it will be active service. And boy, will they do service. John F. Funk had a son-in-law who worked some in the colleges and in the publishing. His name was A.B. Kolb. We know him. We sing one of his songs, Christ Who Left His Home in Glory, is a song that A.B. Kolb wrote. He was also active in this time in the Elkhart area, and he wrote this about the active service of that day. He said, the modern system of Christianity has become all work. One continued, earnest, active, hurrying, rushing, hustling, pushing world of active work. And the young people loved it. They finally felt like this is what we're living for. But A.B. Kolb, he counseled that our young people need to learn how to hold quiet communion with God. And so even back then they were concerned about this. But the Mennonites in the 20th century would do lots of active service. All right, let's go to the events that have to do with the development of Mennonite denominational organizations and institutions. This is Daniel Kaufman. I know he looks like a real grump, but he had a difficult life, okay? You would not have wanted to live his life, so give him some slack. Okay, he is probably the one person more responsible, if any man is, for helping to push the denominational identity as anyone. And so then there's the founding of the colleges and, the fundamentalist articles of faith and doctrines of the Bible. If there's two books that every good Mennonite had on their shelf, it was Martyr's Mirror and Doctrines of the Bible. And I don't know, go home and look on your grandparents' shelf. It's probably true. It might even be true for you. I still have the students do some things with Doctrines of the Bible occasionally. All right, so at this time we should probably try to define some terms. Maybe it'll make better sense if we try to back up here and define a couple terms. So denominations is an interesting New World organizational form that churches followed that developed in a land of religious freedom. Back in Europe, in the old world, you didn't have denominations. You had the state church, You know, if you're in England, you're part of the Anglican Church. If you're in France, you're part of the Catholic Church. If you're in Germany, you're part of the Lutheran Church. And they kind of give the directives and the authority and the organization. So you had the state church. If you dared to separate from that, then you were called a sect. And this is where we get our word sectarian. All right, so those were the two options. And of course, the Anabaptists were a sect. The Pilgrims who landed up in Massachusetts, they were a sect. And many of the groups who came to the New World, they were persecuted, and so they were a sect. So you had the state church, you had the sect. Those were your two options. In the state church, approval and authority was given by the state. Membership was automatic, hence infant baptism. And the doctrines were defined by the authorities, right? Now, if you were a sect, you were a heretic, or at best a sectarian. And so you were frowned on and probably persecuted. You were membership by choice for sure. And your doctrines were probably defined by your little group and your brotherhood. But what happens when you move to America and the government intentionally denies official status to any would-be state church? Not allowed. Can't have it. What happens to a sect then? Because the only way a sect makes sense is if there is a state church. Take the state church away, and then what's a sect? And this is one of the struggles that the Anabaptists and others had when they come to America. They still felt like a sect. But it's gone. This would bring significant change. And so these groups in America soon found out that they really need some kind of authoritative organization. Now, if authoritative control doesn't come from the state, where will it come from? Well, it's going to come from within. And so the group will form, in some way, their own organization, their own controls, their own authority. And the Mennonites, you guessed it, they were maybe a little slow catching on, but eventually they followed the Protestants in forming a denomination. Now, denominations develop in a climate of complete religious freedom, and these denominations will organize certain centers of influence, which then control by right of the membership respecting them. If the membership respects them, they have a lot of control. If the membership does not respect it, they do not have much control. And that's kind of interesting how that works. But by now, here in the 20th century, 21st century, we are very used to denominations, and we are already far enough along in our American story that we've already had reactions to denominations. And maybe you're one of them. I don't know. I don't know what you think of, denominational organization and the development of institutions. But for sure, the Mennonites did it. All right, so from sect to denomination. When the Mennonites came, working through the 19th century, their identity and their loyalties were pretty simple. They had three basic institutions: land, church, and family. My life was simple. You're almost jealous, aren't you? Right? That's a little bit of our reaction coming out, maybe. And by the way, by church, we mean local church. Those were the three basic institutions. That was their identity, and that was their loyalty. In the 20th century, though, there are issues happening. That the enemy is the angel of light, remember, and they are very aware of that. And so they are fighting against that, and so they feel compelled to begin to form protection, helps for the scattered Mennonites out across the United States and Canada. They are starting to reach and feel the need for a unity, lest we be scattered. And so whatever you think and whatever criticism you have for denomination, they felt compelled to do it, or what they were fighting against. And we'll get to that here shortly. And so they began to rally around a new identity and new loyalties, things like conferences and doctrinal statements and mission statements and boards and committees and districts and organizational centers and institutions like publishing houses and colleges. And it got big, it really did. And it held a lot of influence as it started. All right, what were the issues that drove the Mennonites to pursue forming these denominational patterns? Now, obviously, World War I had some effect, and I suppose you've recognized by now that I've just had to kind of sail over the whole issue of non-resistance and Mennonites and wars and all that. We just simply don't have time for everything. But let's focus here on one that still today, in some forms, affects us. And in the turn of the century, the modernism versus fundamentalism issue was very alive. In the Protestant colleges, this has been happening for some time, and it's beginning to be an issue in the Mennonite world. Eventually, Mennonites will feel this influence. So what is modernism? Well, enlightened ideas from the humanists finally creep into the Christian colleges, and they have an effect. And Christians begin to doubt the divine inspiration of the Bible. The Bible is just simply a collection of Hebrew texts from which we can, develop good, sound morals, but not the divine inspiration necessarily. And of course, if it's just good Hebrew text and good Hebrew storytelling, there's no reason really to endorse all the supernatural events or all the prophecies. And of course, this was very liberal thinking. Daniel Kaufman wrote that this is the greatest threat facing the Mennonite church, this liberalism. And so the reaction to that was fundamentalism, which in our world today, fundamentalism is kind of a dirty word. But the fundamentalists of this day cared very much about staying true. They understood the deception, and they wanted to escape it. Possibly you could say, with all this hindsight now, that they got a little extreme. But I tell you, if I were living in that day, knowing how I am, that I hate the idea of thinking that I might be deceived, I think I would have made a pretty good fundamentalist. And it is very typical in the heat of an issue to overreact. Now, fundamentalists began to pound their pulpits about the divinely inspired Word of God, and that it should be interpreted literally. And that literally word is important. Because up to this time, it was generally accepted, even in the Mennonites, that some passages would have a more figurative interpretation. But once the modernist fundamentalist issue intensified and the rope started getting tight, to suggest that a passage had a figurative interpretation was to be branded a modernist. And so you needed to stay literal. That was safe. And remember, it was a time of great intensity, with the threat of deception and the threat of these influential people coming in on the top and leading people astray. And of course, they put a lot of stock, rightly so, in the supernatural and prophetic events of Scripture. This issue was very active in the Protestant world. This issue split Princeton University. I think maybe the other college that formed on the fundamentalist side was maybe Wesleyan or something like that. And it eventually made its way into the Mennonite world as well. Here's a cartoon from that time showing the descent of the modernists, starting out embracing Christianity and taking one step at a time and getting to the point where he embraces atheism, holding his head high. So what influence did fundamentalism have on the Mennonites? The Mennonites are conservative thinkers, and so they're going to be influenced by fundamentalism. Well, there's at least three ways. The first we've talked about already on the timeline. In 1921, the General Conference will meet in Garden City, Missouri. And they will adopt a new set of articles. Statement of faith. You've got one of these probably. Now, this says in here somewhere, maybe in the front, that, this is ours, that this was adopted in Garden City, Missouri, 1921. What did we have before that? Well, we had the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. And I don't know if you ever read the Dordrecht Confession of Faith, but if you would read Article 1 in the Dordrecht Confession of Faith, it begins with the belief in the existence of the Trinity. Yours today doesn't begin with that. That's number 2 today. Number 1, we believe in the plenary. Oh boy, there's a big word. What the world does plenary mean? Anybody know? Well, I think it means something like absolute or total. We believe in the plenary and verbal inspiration of the Bible as the Word of God, that it is authentic in its matter, authoritative in its counsels, inerrant in the original writings, and the only infallible rule of faith and practice. And you can feel the emotion when they wrote that. They were in the middle of a serious issue. And so that became article number 1. And it's called the Fundamentals. There's another side issue to all this, and it has to do with going to the extremes, tightening up the rope, and feeling like everything must be interpreted literally. And that is this issue of premillennialism. And so we, of course, live on the after side of that. And today we kind of look back on that and maybe laugh at how they got so wound up in there. But see how this was tied to the issue of the day? Premillennialism is a literal way to interpret Revelation and a literal way to interpret the Old Testament prophecies concerning Israel. And, of course, they bought into that big word called dispensationalism. And, of course, they bought into the ideas of the rapture and pre-trib and premillennialism and all of that. It became very controversial in Mennonite circles. And as you probably know, good Mennonites before this time were all millennials. That's kind of figurative. And so now we have premillennialism. And this community, Washington County, was kind of on the traditional side of this, and they wanted to hold to their amillennialist view. George R. Brunk I came through here. He was kind enough not to preach premillennialism from the pulpit, but then he'd come to your house on Sunday afternoon and really go at it. And he really got things stirred up around here, and the ministry got concerned. Thankfully, George R. Brunk wrote a nice letter of apology, apologizing for stirring up the issue. And that's saying a lot for George R. Brunk I, because he was quite the opinionated individual and known for his fundamentalism. He is, by the way, the founder of the Sword and Trumpet magazine that's still going today. Now, as the years went by, premillennialism gained a lot of attraction, and I would say that probably most of us here tonight have endorsed. I never quite bought into the pre-trib, I'll just be that honest with you, but I kind of like the premillennialism. In fact, about 5 years ago, I would say that premillennialism pretty much won the day. Except, would you believe it, that in the last 5 years or so, the young people are changing. They kind of look back on the whole Protestant premillennialism premillennial, that big-time money-making marketing, movies and books, selling that wild story of how the Lord's going to destroy this world, Left Behind series and all that. They kind of mock that. And full circle, we are back to a figurative interpretation being promoted again, and I find that interesting. All right, the third way is that Eastern Mennonite College would be founded in the East. It did not take long for the Mennonites to become alarmed at the liberalism of Goshen College. And so in reaction to that, they decided to come in here to the very staunchly conservative East and start a college. Surely that would work. The people that started Eastern Mennonite College were determined that this would be a bastion of conservatism and fundamentalism. So speaking of colleges, why did the Mennonites start colleges? So of course we could park here for a long time. This could be an entire, discussion. Education. I'll just be frank with you. I've been involved in education all these years and I still hardly know what to think sometimes. It really is quite an animal to wrestle with. The truth is, the colleges were started by men who cared deeply about the Mennonite church. That's just the fact of the matter. And I think we can consider that it was a genuine concern. They wanted to teach Mennonite doctrines and values. They were concerned about the loss of young people in the American school system. See, this is back in the days before the Christian day school movement. And so they go to the schools and their influence there, and then we have to somehow mop that up later. And of course, they wanted to equip new leaders for guiding congregations who were moving away from rural lifestyles. One of the realities of starting an institution, it's almost a guarantee, as soon as you start an institution, there will be a left-leaning undercurrent. That just becomes a fact. Institutions drift left. In fact, it takes a lot of energy to work against that. If gifts and talents and money and abilities were enough to fight against that, then Mennonite colleges should have been incredibly successful. From the beginning, there were two educational philosophies. One was a philosophy that centered around liberation. The other one centered around indoctrination. And so already in the forming of these colleges, you see a tug of war set up again. People like C. Henry Smith, this is their idea of education, to break up the old habits of thought and destroy the ruts into which we have fallen. And then we will be liberated. Daniel Kaufman disagreed. He maybe couldn't use quite as poetic a language, but he just simply straight out said our young people should be thoroughly indoctrinated in the principles of true Christianity. And you probably know this, but the dirtiest word in education today is the word indoctrination. That word has been crucified all over the place. But I will tell you that at this school, we are still committed to indoctrination unapologetically. And you'll just have to call us fools. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't try to break some old habits. Well, if you come into my room with really sloppy, I shouldn't get too practical here. If you come into my room with really sloppy penmanship, I might try to break that old habit, but it is not going to feel like liberation at first. It's going to feel like discipline. In fact, you might tell me to just bug off already. You might even call it indoctrination. And so it's quite controversial. And it's always hard to know who was the most influential in the colleges, the students or the professors. Obviously both, but I am intrigued at the power and the influence of the student body. Of course, you know this. Their attitudes can sway, powerful attitudes. In one of the Mennonite colleges, there's just a little anecdote of a student who came into the science lab one day with the Rules and Regulations book. And he brought it in. He said, "I'm going to put it under the microscope so I can read between the lines." Wow. Well, where do you think an attitude like that's going to take a college if they're mocking the rules and regulations of the church and authority? You know what's interesting? These colleges started with all kinds of grants to get vocational programs in place, especially ag programs. They really wanted to get the ag science going. They spent money to get those programs in place and nobody would sign up. I mean, that makes perfect sense. The Mennonite farm boys didn't need college to go learn how to farm. The farm boys in my classroom don't even need high school, let me tell you. Okay? The people showing up at these colleges didn't want to be farmers. They wanted to be professionals. They wanted to be teachers and social activists and ministers. And so the ag programs, they were well-meaning and well-intentioned, but it just didn't work. The power of the student body. And of course, these graduates would leave college and return to their return to their communities with a sense of empowerment. And so here comes Mr. Graduate with degree behind his name, 26 years old. What's the elder minister going to feel like? He's at a time in his life when he should be respected for his wisdom and his experience, but he's sidelined in favor of the degree. And more the wise elder takes his place in the shadows. Here's a cartoon that was drawn by Ernest G. Gaiman. He used to draw illustrations for the Sword and Trumpet back in the day. Ernest Gaiman was also a professor at Eastern Mennonite College for 50 years. And he was a conservative. Now you look at that drawing and you think about a college professor drawing that. That's interesting. And there's a lot we could discuss there. Blindfolded dad for one thing. But the most intriguing thing to me is that he drew, look at his power source. Look what's powering that machine. A big pulley that's powered from something deep in the earth. Insightful. Well, that's enough for colleges. Let's move on. This kind of sets the stage for Daniel Kaufman. Here's Daniel Kaufman as a young man. Quite the stash. Daniel Kaufman is a good example of a young man who did not join the church until he was in his mid-20s. This is actually a picture of him when he was county commissioner. So he got involved in some politics. Yeah, he was making good use of his leadership skills. Well, I don't know. Whatever you want to say about this man, you can't deny that he had a genuine burden for the Mennonite church. And he would become probably the most influential Mennonite man of the 20th century, especially in the development of the Mennonite denomination. So Daniel Kaufman was born in Pennsylvania 1865, but he grew up in Missouri, converted in 1890 at the preaching of S Kaufman, age 25. He was a prolific writer, writing doctrines of the Bible and working on that book from about 1900 all the way up through whenever it was that Doctrines of the Bible was last revised and published. Gospel Herald editor, numerous books. He helped to instigate the forming of General Conference, 1898. He tried to do what he could to help the Mennonite church in a difficult time, and he gets credit for helping to bring all the scattered Mennonite groups into a sort of a doctrinal unity. Say what you want about all that denominational control, but we are, interestingly, spread out across the United States and Canada. You can travel all the way to Wisconsin or Missouri or maybe even further, and you can find people that think a lot like we do, and their doctrinal statement probably says Garden City. And so there's some value to that. Like I said, Kaufman didn't have an easy life. He suffered the loss of his wife. He later remarried a former student of his who was 14 years younger than him. Numerous of his children died young. He suffered accidents, illnesses, loneliness. But by the time he died in 1944, he had served in just about every committee that the Mennonite church had established. I think at one time he served on 22 different boards and committees. This is the era of Mennonite church history where we make jokes, like how many Mennonite committees does it take to change a light bulb? You can't have a fellowship meal until you form at least 3 committees and things like that. So say what you want, that's fine, but try to notice or try to appreciate the good that they brought. In 1898, Mennonite Church General Conference was established. There were 2 stated reasons for its formation: to define and establish orthodox teaching in the face of liberalism, and to bring about unity and uniformity among the Mennonite church groups. And of course, yes, they formed all kinds of committees. One Mennonite wrote in his diary, "One cannot make the slightest move without bumping into a committee. Committees and boards have multiplied like a plague in Egypt." And we probably have our opinions about that. But I want you to think about, again, that unity that it has brought to us and the value that is brought to us. This can affect us personally, One of the cultural traits that is currently going on in our circles is that my students have been hearing me harp on this, so they know what I'm going to say. The boy doesn't marry the hometown girl anymore. In fact, I hardly have boy-girl issues in high school anymore. I shouldn't say that. I might get in trouble. It'll change tomorrow. But, and so you think about where our age group, look at that side of the house. We've pulled them in from all over the place. And there they are, and they probably had a few adjustments when they came around here. But they made it, the doctrinal statement still said Garden City. And so there's some benefit to that. And yes, there were a lot of committees, no doubt about it. All right, doctrinal unity. Lots of books written about this, so that maybe one thing to say about doctrines of the Bible is even through the beginning decades of the 20th century, this distinction is still evident. So when you pick up the doctrines of the Bible, you still see this very careful organization, but distinction. The plan of salvation is first, and then there are 7 clearly defined ordinances. Not 6, not 8. There are 7. And then there are the restrictions. And so even up through the 30s and 40s, you have this. And the doctrines of the Bible would become something of an authority in the Mennonite world. To challenge the doctrines of the Bible was to be kind of maybe a modernist. And of course, the Gospel Herald took the banner from Heralds of Truth. The publishing moved from Elkhart to Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. And from there, Daniel Kaufman wrote extensively, promoting a lot of things. Lots of rules, lots of dress standards. You wonder where the Mennonites got focused on all those rules and regulations? Well, it was during this time. It wasn't that they invented a whole lot of new dress standards. They were dressing a lot like they did. But people were beginning to get worldly and slip away, and they were worried about that. And so, true to their organizational nature, they just started making rules and regulations, and that made sense to them, and so they did it. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go to these two men here. This is these men, this is probably one of the most significant contributions of the Mennonite colleges. But these two men spent years in libraries in Europe, poring over German documents that would bore you and me to tears. And they began to formulate and try to understand and write our history. John Horst was the first, and this man's library is still at Goshen College, I believe. It was extensive. He would eventually write the book Mennonites in Europe, that is a textbook used often. And then Harold Bender came along later. He married John Horst's daughter, so this is a father and son-in-law. And Harold Bender was a historian as well. And I have wondered how much we would know about our history if these men would not have did what they did. And of course, they waded through all the documents and put it into very concise form. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Harold Bender's little book called The Anabaptist Vision. If you haven't, it's just a little book you can read in 20 minutes. Here it is. You can get it from Christian Light, Amazon.com, thin little book. And if you want to know the essence of Anabaptist belief and practice, this is it. He gave it as a speech in the middle of World War II in 1943 at the American Society of Church History. Interestingly, Harold Bender was the president of that society. And so it was the presidential address. And he gave this to a broad range of historians, not just Mennonites. And this brought a fair amount of respect to the Anabaptist movement. See, what did the Protestants think of Anabaptists up to that time? It was kind of a derogatory term, right? Anabaptist, that meant someone who is a sectarian, someone who is against the right way. It was a derogatory term. That's what an Anabaptist was. Harold Bender changed that with one speech that was eventually published as an essay. It's probably the most famous speech, most influential speech in American Mennonite history. In getting to the root of the essence of Anabaptism, Harold Bender began to bring the faith works thing back together. The plan of salvation and discipleship went back together. Here's two short quotes from this book. The whole life was to be brought under the lordship of Christ in a covenant of discipleship. And so he begins to emphasize discipleship again. Not so much plan of salvation, but lordship and discipleship. And here's another interesting, in trying to understand the German language that the Anabaptists use and trying to come up with words in the English, Harold Bender needed a word, an English word, to get a hold of the essence of Anabaptism. I don't know what word you would have chosen, but he actually chose a very simple word. He chose the word following. Now, it's not that the Anabaptists had an issue with faith. That statement there needs to be understood in light of what was going on in the Reformation. Luther had a concept of faith, right? So he's reacting against Luther's idea of faith. And he's saying that the Anabaptists were followers. And so that has become one of the most important words to the Mennonites. Following. We mean a lot when we say following. John Koblenz just wrote this new book. You probably have seen this. It's fresh out. This is the book that churches are studying here, you know. If anyone would follow me, that's the title. I have decided to follow Jesus. What that did was give the word Anabaptist a new definition. When you use the word Anabaptist today, you are not thinking about a derogatory term, right? You are thinking, when someone says, I'm an Anabaptist, you are thinking about a follower of Jesus. Now, I don't know it would be interesting to know which identity you associate closer with. The Mennonite identity or the Anabaptist identity. Now, young people more and more are gravitating toward that Anabaptist word. That means a lot of things today. I know we're going to look at that here shortly. It's an interesting new identity. And it's actually one that's surprisingly all-encompassing. Without really thinking about it, Harold Bender opened up a grand new world of possibilities. Because what is a follower of Jesus? Now, it's not Harold Bender's fault. He wrote an excellent book. I like his book. But it was written and published at a time when the Mennonites were just looking for a way to shed that denominational identity which was connected to restrictions. And Harold Bender provided it. Now I can just be a follower of Jesus. Well, what is that? And so ironically, this new identity, it would soon become hard to identify who an Anabaptist was. A follower of Jesus might look like Daniel Kaufman, but it might also look like this. And everything in between. I mean, after all, Jesus, I'm following Jesus, and Jesus was a political activist. Jesus was counterculture. A follower of Jesus might look like that, but a follower of Jesus might look like that. After all, Jesus cared a lot about the marginalized. Well, it's not Harold Bender's fault. There were things in place, things were happening. You know what? What we need is an old-fashioned revival. That's what we need. So let's have one of those. This is a picture of the Brunk revivals in 1951, and I mean, look at the car parking that happened there. Organization, wow. Even at your tent meeting. I'm curious, is there anyone here that went to a Brunk revival? Hey, we still have some that, and you knew you weren't supposed to, right? Okay, all right. How old were you doing? Barely remember it. Yeah, okay, so now I need to be careful what I say. It's quite a time. Revivals were the thing to do. Revival campaigns, tent campaigns were the thing to do. Billy Graham was at the height of his career. 1949, Billy Graham had his famous Los Angeles revival, and it was very successful, and if Billy Graham can be successful, surely the Mennonites can too. And so, it was the thing to do. I hate to say it was cool, but, you know, it was the thing to do. And so thousands of people, sometimes they set up more than one tent. According to the Mennonite Encyclopedia, the Crusades were a dramatic change from traditional Mennonite experience. And now this is George R. Brunk II. George's oratorical skills, showmanship, and plain-speaking preaching style influenced many to make life-changing decisions. A typical theme of Brunk's was Holy Spirit empowerment. And of course, there was a lot of emotionalism. Some of the emotionalism was just showing up to do the thing there was to do. This is the thing to do. That was part of the emotion. It was exciting. It was great. Others The emotionalism was very different. The preaching could very easily make you feel like you were not right with God, which is typical of revivalism. And as you can expect, the conservatives did not like this. The ministry in Washington County churches discouraged their membership from attending. Again, it's kind of discouraging because I don't know how many times I've heard people say, we just need old-fashioned revival. That's what we need. But, well, then why didn't it work? If revival alone could have solved the issue, surely this should have worked. Well, there were thousands of first-time converts, and we won't question that or be critical of it. Be glad for every soul that was saved. But Mennonite churches, in the decade after these revivals, changed rapidly. Some churches stopped holding revivals, reacting against the emotionalism. They got so weary with how they were always feeling guilty every time they went that they finally said, let's just not do that. What did we learn? We have revivals today, but I think we learned something very valuable. Today, we keep revival meetings connected to the local brotherhood experience. And I think that's a very good thing to do. Revivals are good, but in the context of the local brotherhood. When conversions happen, right away, it's right there in the local brotherhood. The conversion is connected to my church. So Lanes Run is having revivals, and we may visit if we want, but it's Lanes Run's revivals. Mount Olive is having revivals. You can visit if you want, but it's Mount Olive's revivals. And I think that has been a healthy change for us. Well, it's time to wrap this up. Of course, by now the train is moving so fast and furious, it feels out of control. And so by the 60s, there are discussions about how we jump off this thing. Did you ever jump off of a fast-moving train? It's not easy. You talk to anyone who came through the 60s, they will tell you this is the most difficult thing they did in their life. It divided families, it divided friends. Whatever decision you made, it was difficult. The people that jumped, yeah, that was hard. The people that stayed on, hoping to somehow be a good positive influence on the fast-moving train, that wasn't easy either. It was the toughest in the West. In the West, they were a family here and a family there. Just a few that would decide it's time to get out. They didn't often have a lot of fellowship. They experienced a lot of loneliness. Eventually, in the sorting out, they would find little groups like themselves and begin to form fellowships. Here in the East, it was different. We had more people with us when we left, but it was still hard. And again, Washington County is unique. I don't know, we're just a unique bunch of people. I read this in a book by an author who lives outside of our community, and he's looking on the history of our community. And he said, Washington County, Maryland is unique because in Washington County, Maryland, unique in the Mennonite world, this is apparently the only area where a majority of the churches stayed conservative. Well, that's putting things actually in a pretty good light because you all know how difficult and messy and controversial that division was. Well, I'm not sure how much more to say. It's about time to close this operation. But I hope you can appreciate what your grandpa or your great-grandpa did. when he jumped. Can you appreciate that? See, we're wrestling again with a culture and a situation that I don't know what it feels like to you. Does it feel like the 50s again, maybe? I don't know. But I hope you can get a hold of the sacrifice that your ancestors made to give you something valuable. And I hope you can appreciate it. And of course, another thing that we have going for us is we have these groups that we associate with. I didn't put them all up here, but here they are. We can go to Pennsylvania. We can go to the Midwest. I don't even have them all up here. We can go to Virginia. And they're like-minded brethren. We can do things together. We still have a semblance of unity amongst us. That is very valuable. Don't throw that away. All right, let's close this. Following Jesus is still the right focus. That is still priority number one. Don't let that focus change. But in your following Jesus, keep and maintain a deep respect for the institutions of authority that the Mennonites have developed. We have been critical of them. But anywhere humans try to do anything together, systems of authority will emerge. You can't get away from that. Don't waste your time reacting against it. You can't predict the future any better than they can. They are looking out for your good. It is a good thing. Yes, I know you can find your faults, but it has done you well. Don't fight it. Respect it. Respect the culture. Anywhere humans try to do things together, culture will develop. And some of you caught me taking a picture of our church this morning. I was kind of disappointed that I had to take a picture of a church where the wind, church is falling apart. But I decided then that that's kind of symbolic, right? I mean, the winds blow against our culture and people mock it and they make fun of it and they make our culture look stupid. And I don't like it. The winds are going to blow. Let them blow. Your culture is doing very important things for you. Respect it. I mean, follow Jesus first. Don't focus primarily on the culture. Follow Jesus, but respect your culture. It is a tremendous blessing. Honor it. And last of all, follow Jesus, but respect the tension. Anywhere humans try to do things together, tension will develop. Don't waste your energy trying to win the tug-of-war game. Honor that brother who's pulling the other way. It is your best path forward. So in other words, follow Jesus and honor your heritage. It is one of your most valuable possessions. Thanks for your time, and Lord bless.
$747. $747.